Hello and welcome back to Digital Lunch. We've been around for a while last year and we've restarted this year with the topic of open government partnership. Bit of a mouthful, not really that clear what it means, but effectively it's a joint project set up by the US and the UK governments to try and encourage openness in the way that government provides information and and the partnership end of it implies that this isn't simply just a government deal, that somehow there is a connection or a relationship to be made there somehow between civil society and government itself. But before going into too much more detail and before opening up the discussion to our panel here, we have with us Paul Braithwaite from Building Change Trust in Belfast. Paul, just give us a bit of a brief explainer and background as to why we're talking about open government partnership.
Okay, so very briefly, for those of you who don't know, the Building Change Trust was set up in 2008. It exists essentially to promote and support the community and voluntary sector and social enterprise sector in Northern Ireland. So one of the themes within which we carry out that mandate is called Creative Space for Civic Thinking. And within that, essentially, we're looking at the role of civil society, and specifically the voluntary community social enterprise sector, as a kind of interlocutor between citizens and the state. So we have a number of sort of actions planned under that theme over the coming years. For example, we're hoping to resource some innovative, creative civic engagement tools and approaches in Northern Ireland. But I suppose, you know, building capacity and resourcing practice is only one side of the equation. And I suppose our consultations with the sector in the latter part of last year really established the perception that there are structural blockages in Northern Ireland to the practice of civic participation. So some of those are for cultural reasons. Obviously, the post-conflict context has an impact. Some to do with the nature of government systems and processes, and many of these are common factors that exist everywhere, but some are unique to Northern Ireland. So there's at least a perception on the part of the third sector, of the voluntary community social enterprise sector in Northern Ireland, that participation, transparency and accountability are not being practiced as core principles of government in Northern Ireland. I don't think it's contentious to say that. People would point to things like, you know, the experience of freedom of information requests, the sort of legislation around political party financing, from a civil society perspective, the closure of the civic forum. You could go on, and I'm sure the other contributors will give other examples. So I suppose we came across the Open Government Partnership as potentially an overarching framework for mobilising local civil society around these issues. I mean, our plan essentially only goes as far as first bringing it to people's attention. I mean, the first thing to note is that almost nobody in Northern Ireland has heard of the Open Government Partnership, and that included us until a few months ago. So we just simply want to draw people's attention to it and then gauge interest in maybe taking it further from there. So just to explain for those who don't know what the OGP is, as Mick said, it's an international intergovernmental initiative. It was announced, I think, in 2011. There were 8 founding countries, one of which was the UK. David Cameron is on record as having said he wants them to be the most open and transparent government in history, and so we'll take him at his word. And this is one of the mechanisms through which they want to do that. A feature that is of particular interest to us is that it functions in every member country on the basis of a government-civil society partnership. So in theory, an OGP civil society network exists in every country, and they should drive the consultation process, leading to a co-created action plan which both the government and civil society endorse. Of course, the civil society group can also criticise that, and its function is also within the partnership to hold to account. But the UK has signed up, is now on its second action plan. Ireland then signed up last year. So in terms of our Northern Ireland circumstances, all the jurisdictions surrounding us are signed up. But somehow Northern Ireland has fallen between the cracks, and particularly in the UK case, that's because it's led by the Cabinet Office in London. And so the commitments that are in the National Action Plan relate as far as I can tell, entirely to Whitehall departments, and because of the nature of devolution, therefore, for example, if they're making commitments about transparency and citizen participation within the NHS, then the commitment is made on behalf of NHS England, and because Northern Ireland, the NHS Northern Ireland has not specifically signed up to that, then it doesn't apply here. So we've sort of fallen between the cracks, and similarly then the civil society network is fairly London-centric, and they would admit that themselves, and that's not necessarily a criticism, it's maybe just where the process has got to. So we'd be keen to see if there's interest in when the next sort of action planning process comes around in the Open Government Partnership, whether we could make it, whether we could get Northern Ireland and other devolved regions making specific commitments to include within that. So as I said, our plan is simple. We're just going to bring it to the attention of the sector. Mick has been helping us with a bit of blogging. We brought a group from Northern Ireland down to the OGP Europe conference in Dublin last week, which was a really interesting experience. Lots of innovative practice to hear about there, and even some political will on the part of government representatives, which was refreshing. So it's all leading up to our seminar on Friday in Belfast, where we've got Tim Hughes from Involve, who's the chair of the UK OGP network, coming across, and we've got somebody from the Republic of Ireland OGP working group, Nat O'Connor from TASC, coming up as well to speak to that, and a range of other contributors. And I suppose this digital lunch was also convened as part of the run-up to that. But I suppose a key part of the OGP as a framework, one of its key strengths is in the international exchange and learning that can take place. So obviously we're particularly focused on Northern Ireland, but whatever happens in terms of our future work around this, we'll certainly want to integrate that element of it. So digital lunches like this may be not only a thing for now, but a thing for the future too. So I think that's probably
that's Thanks
enough.
for that. Now, one of the things you picked up there, I mean, some of this is about agenda setting, and clearly there's an agenda trying to be set here by David Cameron, the most open and transparent country in the world. It contrasts quite a bit, Fred, with the Taoiseach's outline that it wants to be the best little country for business. Government agendas are often... Sorry, I'll flick the camera on to me while I'm talking. Government agendas are one thing. The actuality's something rather different, Fred. And you have a lot of experience of FOI in the Republic.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that FOI, freedom of information, should be contrasted with open government and open data, in that it's in the same area of accessing government information, but through a different mechanism. Whereas open government, open data is basically an expression of a political policy to make information accessible to the public and in a form whereby it can be reused. Freedom of information and similar laws in most civilized countries, and particularly within Europe, give the public a right of access to information that's held by or on behalf of public bodies. So what that means, in essence, is that most freedom of information laws presume that information should be accessible unless there are certain exceptions which apply. And in many cases, even where the exceptions apply, the public interest can be used to overrule those exceptions. So it's important to understand that the two systems of accessing public information are complementary, but operate using different mechanisms. And of course, there is certainly going to be an overlap between the two. So the other thing to note is that our experience using access to information laws, such as freedom of information, is a lot longer than open data, open government, which has been around. It's a more recent invention. So it might be useful to see if there are lessons can be learned from the application of freedom of information. So for example,
I mean, just to point out that one of the things became obvious during the OGP conference, the European Regional Conference in Dublin at the weekend, was that Ireland's only one of 3 countries in the world which has FOI legislation that also charges for it. It's almost as though this is a thing that has been imposed upon government that it clearly finds awkward, difficult, perhaps just difficult to service the demand given the architecture in which information is stacked. But how much of this is generally seen within government as a kind of a bitter pill they have to swallow but don't really want to?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between government and the public service when dealing with that issue. It's true to say Ireland, in 1998, when the Freedom of Information Act was introduced in Ireland, there were no upfront fees, but there were fees to cover the costs of searching for information. But in 2003, the Fianna Fáil coalition government brought in fees essentially as a way to manage demand, so to reduce the number of requests. And the most recent Freedom of Information Bill has sought to continue the use of upfront fees and to actually increase them for more sophisticated or more complex requests. And this is actually a complete U-turn on behalf of the Irish government, who, in their programme for government when they were elected in 2011, promised to restore the Freedom of Information Act to the condition it was in when it was enacted in 1998. It seems to me that the resistance really is coming from it's a cultural resistance from the public service, in that they are of the view that that freedom of information requests, or handling the requests, is in some respects incompatible with good public administration because it diverts resources away from doing proper work. So it's the kind of, as you say to the police, why don't you go and catch some proper criminals kind of attitude towards public servants providing information to the public. It also completely ignores the fact that their systems or their way of working can be adapted to mitigate that overhead, but that's not something that is ever considered. So, so to sum it up, I think that there's a cultural resistance to making information accessible in public service. And it has its origins in the kind of bureaucratic top-down management style under which they operate. Mick.
I just put myself on mute while you were talking there, Fred. So yeah. I suddenly found myself uncharacteristically speechless. Davey, this point about participation, because it isn't really just, if the word partnerships to mean anything, it isn't really just about sitting passively waiting for government to come and do something or to kind of react in a certain way. So can you kick us off a little bit? And I know for a fact participation was a serious concern at OGP, that building systems and expecting people to come, if there's nothing in there, or there's no particularly fun, I think is a word that was used in terms of just what creates participation online. What's your experience in Northern Ireland, David?
Well, yeah, there are a number of things coming out here which are all different but come under the same umbrella. The data versus information, which are really two different things. Providing information and, as you say, making it not just accessible, but how do you engage people to make the approach to find, to either ask a question or make use of what's available. I was going through some of the data.gov.uk before the event today, and there's a massive amount of information there, but it is dry. I mean, you use the word fun. I think the opposite of fun in these terms is dry. It is incredibly dry. How participation, waiting for participation is active. It comes from both sides. I can give you an example of where I think Northern Ireland has been good in being participative, where the executive has been good and participative, but I can give you examples of where other people who I've worked with have tried to participate. Now, I think Paul Smith, my former colleague from Public Achievement, might go into this in some detail at the event on Friday. But I'll give you an example where I think consultation, which tends to be both ineffective and very unsatisfactory here, actually did work. And that was when a project came along called United Youth. When it appeared, people were, to be honest, I was working in the Public Achievement at the time, and a lot of people working in the youth and community sector were skeptical, I think is the kindest word to use. It appeared not to be thought through. It appeared to be just something that was hurriedly posted among the politicians who began to talk about it, but there was really no depth to it. Then, when the civil servants got hold of it, one tends to think that they're going to hide it away and really make participation very difficult. Quite the opposite happened. The participation was genuine. It was very public. There was a very large event, which not only included people from the sector, but also included young people. And this is where Paul was very active. So the consultation on United Youth has been incredibly open, transparent, and to this degree successful. And that is government coming, or the civil service in this case, coming to the public to consult with them. I've been involved in a number of consultations and very often wondered why I bothered, because nothing seems to. It's a one-way. It appears to be a one-way conversation. But engaging particularly young people, which I was doing through the WIMPs, Where's My Public Servant project, engaging them, getting them to think about what it is they want to know about, what they want, what opinions they want, not just opinions, but information that they need, and spending some time working on a number of projects like that will improve participation, but also improves an understanding what people need to know, or particularly young people again need to know. And I find that incredibly difficult at times. But I actually find that both the civil service and, in particular, the MLAs welcomed it. Maybe less so in some areas, but in general it was very welcoming. So it wasn't a case of pandering to young people or talking down to them, but actually engaging in proper conversations with them, which I found very, very useful.
John, I'm going to come to you briefly.
Yeah.
This thing about, this thing about fun, and as Davey puts it, the opposite of fun being dryness. What is it that drives participation, and particularly because I get a sense one of the common themes in Dublin was this idea of resistance, that even that applies to civil society. There was one speaker from the floor from Tunisia who basically had some concerns that civil society was in danger of being co-opted into delivering government and therefore small p political agendas. That there are all kinds of anxieties around this that kind of, in a way, freeze people or pull people back from doing something silly, stupid, embarrassing, or mistaken. So how do we get over that? And how do we have a sense of fun whilst retaining some kind of seriousness at the base of it?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many lessons you can sort of take, right? And I absolutely agree with sort of the participatory is absolutely essential, right? But what if it's also pivotal? What if we could sort of make it so participatory so the participation process itself begins to affect policy? Then kind of the policies will sort of be less crappy, right? And once they are in the public view, I mean, they're kind of seen as slightly more meaningful, slightly more coached in language that actually kind of they can understand. They know that they are not sort of invited in as an afterthought, but they're actually kind of making a difference for not only after the policy and sort of living with the consequences, but actually in the actual formulation of the policies themselves, right? So this is I'm going to make a jump to kind of really great video. I'm going to link it afterwards. There's a guy who's been basically doing 30 years of research in terms of literacy. He's an American. In the video he's great because he's really pissed, right? But he's kind of still civil in the actual video presentation because he has long experience. So what he basically says is that if you really want to be not only engaging but inclusive, you need to do absolutely 4 things. You need to be mindful of what's the social practice of all stakeholders. So you don't sort of put something nice in and then they sort of go back home and feel disempowered, disenfranchised, or whatever this they feel, right? In terms of policy, it needs to be so they're invited in, engaged, and included, so they actually see that we're not invited as an afterthought. This sort of affects policy. This is aligning with eventually, and this includes those who are dissonant, right? As much as sort of that policy framework can take. It also needs to be actionable. And this is kind of one of those things that is kind of the truth test of engagement, right? You do know that it is really an engaging thing, practice, process, whatever. It leads to kind of tangible outcomes. But it also kind of most crucially, and this holds not only for Ireland. I mean, Ireland is traditionally known for storytelling. I mean, I come from north of Sweden, where storytelling is as equally as valid, as deep and powerful, right? And as different as Stockholm, the capital. And that's experience. So you're summing up very shortly. So experience, action, movement, and social practice. So if we can sort of cram all those in, and basically kind of what we need to do then is kind of revamp the whole sort of policy formulation process, almost from grounds up. But if we
That's
do, then that I'm almost sort of guarantee that it will make a difference.
Okay, Matilda, that gives us quite a handy segue across to you, in the sense that John's talking about the theory of it, that actually this thing has to be actionable. It has to have credible and effective changes or results before you, almost as a precondition of engaging mind, body, soul, resource, expense, any of that stuff. And as I understand it, at Democratic Society, you've got some experience to share with us of a number of practical projects that have some actual use.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of projects we're working on. And we've been working on open policy making with the Cabinet Office at a national level. Anyway, but what I think is probably more interesting to talk about is a current project we have with NHS England, because this is really looking at how not only do you do open policy making, but you design the actual process in public and how that gets people on board. I think that, yes, you're right. There is a reputational problem. If you haven't started yet, do people want to get involved? I think there's also issues of over-consultation. Do people believe this is a consultation like any other? If they do, they won't take part, because particularly people who are part of vulnerable groups. You find it with local councils. Local councils are always consulting the same group of people and nothing ever changes in their lives. So the more that happens, the less they want to take part, and of course the more difficult it becomes. So I think I think you can probably carry that over to NHS England. There are obviously a lot of patient groups, and a lot of patients are contacted by people to find out what they think, and then seemingly nothing changes, or with the NHS at the moment, things that they don't really understand or don't really want to happen are happening, or they think are happening. So we undertook with Involve as well. I know that you were speaking about Tim a little while earlier. We have a group of 4, which is Tavistock Institute, Public Eye, ourselves and Involve, are working on creating a new participatory process within NHS England. So obviously that's a bit of a huge undertaking, and there is an element of mistrust automatically. And I think that every type of open policy making is going to experience exactly the same thing. I think with the NHS, because people have such a personal relationship with it, that's maybe slightly more true, but I think with almost all areas, you're not going to start walking into any kind of policy area in the UK without people immediately kind of having some level of mistrust.
So how do you get, Matilda, take it from this. You've got some way down the road with NHS Citizen, and I'd like you to talk about that in a minute.
Oh,
but
God.
The credibility problem that
Yeah.
you talk about when you're trying to initiate something that's outside the experience of senior policymakers, senior civil servants, and not least ministers who have a reputation that can burn within seconds. Now we're in the Twitter age. How do you get over that? What sort of and that's particularly interesting from a Northern Ireland point of view, because we are an inertia city as far as this stuff's concerned.
Well, I think what you were saying before about the civil service is interesting, because I think that we find most of our champions in open policy making across the board from the civil service. You don't really find it necessarily in the politicians, although the Cabinet Office and the Shadow Cabinet Office are interested in open policy making. That goes to politicians too. But there's an element of risk there, which there isn't maybe with civil servants. And civil servants want to see things change, and obviously not all of them, but some, and it's good to have those champions. I think so with the trust issue and with getting people involved. How do you go about doing that? You have to do everything in the open. So if you involve them from the earliest possible minute, we publish all criticism we receive online. with responses. We ensure that we are speaking to some people all the time. You know, we have difficult people speaking to us online, and we try and engage them, and we're honest with them. When we make mistakes, we're honest. We publish documents when they're halfway through being edited. We have citizens taking part in, I think that's probably partially true, from Paul Braithwaite, do politicians see participatory democracy as a threat? At the Council of Europe Welfare and Democracy last year, I think that's exactly what we saw. We saw politicians coming up and talking about how they they were threatened in maybe not quite such strong terms as that, but that's kind of the atmosphere. But with NHS Citizen, what we found is everything, if you do it all in the open, and if people feel like they're taking part, we have events where people are staying after the event till 10 o'clock at night to rewrite the document. You know, this is the vision document which says what NHS England is going to do with NHS Citizen. So because they're so heavily involved, they know that they're the ones writing it. They're co-creating. They're producing themselves. The problem is, if you were saying to somebody, and this is the biggest risk with open policy making across the board, is that actually governments use it to push policies that they already know will be popular. So what they do is they create a supposed open policy making program around certain policy issues that they are not problematic. And then they go, oh, it's brilliant, we've had a load of participation, and look, we've done exactly what we need to do. Well, of course, the public aren't going to be much interested in that. They're never going to be. But at the same time, you're not going to get Trident into open policy making. It's just not going to happen. And with all of these things, there's a risk. So I know that there's this open governance from Transparency International. I've written an open governance scorecard. Now, personally, I can see there's so many problems involved with having straight open governments without open policy making. The legislation is you can't have blanket legislation across departments. People like the FCO have to approach things from a very different perspective than the Cabinet Office, and it also doesn't take into account ambient noise essentially around political spheres in different nations. But that's an aside. I think the flexibility is really important in open policy making. We don't know exactly what our political outlook or how we communicate with people will look like in 10 years. I think everyone probably here would say that we've made some mistakes in data protection by bringing in legislation too soon before we really understood what data was going to look like. And now actually the open policy making is kind of going to conflict with that data protection to a certain extent. And
this is Matilda, something. I mean, it's something Tony Blair remarked upon, and Tony Blair was the one to bring in the Freedom of Information Act, and he confessed many years after it finally got onto the statute book that it was one of the worst things he ever did. You know,
well, from him,
doesn't that actually speak
not part of that, but for him that's quite.
Well, I know, but in a sense, he's a cipher for people with power, people, and what, in a sense, any change agent or someone who wants to advocate greater openness between government and the citizen has to tackle the legitimate roots of that, you know, as you say, the FCO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the DFA in Dublin, these all have to have a high level of secrecy around what they do, and it's, you know, how do you resolve those issues?
Well, we did a training with the FCO. And with open policy making, and particularly using online tools. So I think it was Twitter that we used. So we put them basically in a locked room. They weren't actually tweeting to the outside world, but we were training them in how you would use Twitter to kind of formulate policy on the hoof. Not quite on the hoof, but in certain situations, be they more problematic or less problematic. You know, what is actually going on around you, and it's just that's the way you've got to do it. It has to be a locked room. And for us, coming from a democratic society working on NHS Citizen, where everything is open, and it has to be to gain that level of trust, you just can't take the same approach with everything, which is why I think the flexibility of open policy making, a little bit more experimentation and playing with it for a while and working out exactly what people want, citizens want, how they want it to work, how they want to interact with it is really important. And we've still got the digital divide issue that, although is becoming obviously less and less of an issue, is something that really matters to people. We have a lot of people coming to our meetings saying digital divide. Sorry, I'm talking.
Okay. No, but it's all good stuff, Matilda. It's great stuff because it's right at the right at the core of this. I want to come to John in a minute and just to talk about that one size doesn't fit all, because I think it's a very good point, and that contrast between the very public service of the NHS, where drugs, the drugs bill is a huge issue, where there are flexibility in approaches that can be adopted if you open data and allow citizens, buyers and sellers all to kind of examine the data and find more efficient ways of getting through. I think in biotech particularly, there is a number of participatory approaches to that market problem beginning to come to the fore. But before I come to John about that particular issue, I want to go to Fred, who's speaking to us from Brussels, but actually has major experience of the Dublin space. This idea of incremental change, of culture. There's a lot of, I noticed on Friday, a lot of clashing between open data activists and the minister, and a lot of anger, fire, frustration all around that sort of interface. And yet the government does seem to be making some concrete commitments in a way that it wasn't before.
Well, I think the jury's out about whether the commitments will actually transform themselves into valuable data being made open, and whether or not the government truly becomes an open government in the sense of the ideals of the Open Government Partnership, which include transparency, public participation, and accountability. So I think the commitments are one thing; it's the actual follow-up,
Sure.
the measurement of the effects of the commitments that will actually determine whether or not that's been a success. I think the Open Government Partnership is a good way of doing it, in contrast to freedom of information, in that it has that flexibility which Matilda kind of alluded to there, and it also has ongoing interactions between civil society and the public sector. Kind of a continuous dialogue, I think, is one of the phrases that they used. And it does allow for new ways of working and new ways of interacting to emerge. So it'll be interesting to see over the next year or two how that plays out in Ireland. On the freedom of information side of things, which is more of a legal right, it tends to be more black and white, and it tends to be more a clash of opposing points of view, which often get mediated by the courts or by higher authorities. Here, I think incremental change is kind of difficult to bring about. It's a kind of a big bang, and it's more of a clash of different ways of looking at the world, without the kind of mechanisms or the possibilities for converging on a single set of values. So I think,
from what contacts you've had with the government, and of course it may be very arm's length in the case of the Irish government, have you had the sense that Matilda finds that there are people actually inside the machine who get that this stuff actually might be useful for government rather than just a big stick for citizens to hit them with? At a time when, frankly, the Irish citizenry in the south is really almost on the edge of, when the second largest grouping in an opinion poll is none of the above, i.e., I'm going to vote for someone who isn't in a party. I think you get a sense of just how angry the southern electorate are.
Yeah, no, I've no doubt about that. I'd say quite a few civil servants would be very much in favour of increased transparency, because for them, their organisations are as equally opaque as they are to the ordinary citizen, particularly as you go lower down within the hierarchy. And indeed, in Irish FOI, and I'm sure in the UK as well, there are specific clauses that apply to public servants about how they can access information about how decisions are being taken about them, particularly around promotions and examinations. On the other hand, it's a top-down, bureaucratic, authoritarian institution, which is controlled by a small number of people at the top. And I think that they call the shots, essentially, and that it would be a very brave public servant who went and acted as a champion for transparency without their boss's approval, because it could be career limiting. And the experience to date in Ireland is that the public service is very much against increased transparency by lobbying both, lobbying to maintain upfront fees, by trying to by not implementing the FOI laws within the spirit in which they were enacted, but by resisting disclosure in many cases. And obviously there are notable exceptions to that. And then finally, by trying to resist making information available in a reusable format. With Gavin pioneered the accessing of data sets through FOI, particularly expenses databases. And the problem with that, if you're a public servant, is that there's virtually no search and retrieval. You just have to press a button, and you can email it to somebody in 10 minutes. So there's new provisions in the new bill which basically make it much more difficult to access data sets. And for me, that's a direct conflict with the open government principles and with the open data principles. And just to finish, then, in the UK, with the Protection of Freedoms Act, they actually mandated that data be released under the Freedom of Information Act where possible in reusable format. So the UK used their Freedom of Information law to facilitate open government, to facilitate open data, but in the Republic of Ireland, we seem to be doing the opposite.
That's great. John, I'm going to come to you, but I'm going to come to a point with that Matilda's raised in the background, and she says it's not. I think it's not legitimate to not be open. I think it's legitimate to say that you need to find a way to do things that suits their particular purpose, i.e., that department, that end of government. And what really this is speaking to is the need for if you like, genuine interactions with the public that suit the given purpose. So there isn't there isn't like an open government suit you can just put on and wear and go out to every ball, if you like, open government ball. And there's something here about authenticity and that sort of emphasis on utility that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very hopeful when I hear and listen to Matilda, right? Because what I hear is not only participatory processes and how they can be designed, but also an underlying sort of participatory sense making. I mean, and I think there's some in NHS, and at least in Sweden, in clinics and in pharma settings, that in order to ensure, I mean, let me kind of preface what I mean with sense making. It's kind of how to sort of reach decision quality in conditions of uncertainty and contingencies, right? And it's kind of exactly why some politicians and some civil servants act really strange on the face of it, because we have sort of already tasked them with sort of keeping secrets. We kind of rely on them sort of doing dodgy things in the kind of room immediately preceding the official meeting, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, me having the good fortune of having English as a second language, I'm somewhat immune to having this kind of I mean, what I've kind of tell people in a nutshell, the English language unexamined is empire. So we're right in the middle of sort of keep on doing this sort of big machine that no one else really wants, and besides it's obsolete, and besides it's already beginning to smell funny, at least to those people who are young, who are doing tweeting and doing kind of openness sort of as default, right? I mean, they've grown up with kind of a very different way of looking at things. I mean, let's say 20 years from now, when every one of the citizens is going to do everything to do with democracy, participation, inclusion, involvement through their smartphones. I mean, then what, right? And if we don't send out information, that was kind of useless by default. So then participatory sense making here is flexibility, it is credibility, it is authenticity, it is inclusivity, and then some, right? And these things are kind of useless if we sort of talk about them, but they have become of the essence when we do them. And this is kind of why I was really hopeful when I heard Matilda say, kind of basically lock them away, having them tweet to each other until they get it. But here's the thing, right? They could then sort of quickly become sort of hostages, like, and the most skilled politicians who are sort of being on our side with open government will be those who are most skilled in doublespeak. And this is exactly what we don't want. Right? We don't want to throw out the old geezers who are kind of completely against open government, with those who only pay excellent lip service. I mean, we really want open government. And here's where I've been listening through the whole thing, and open data. Once it's really open and once it really is accessible and useful and becomes a utility for civil society, then actually you can use open data to actually go and have generative assessment. I'm sorry for throwing all these sort of strange words out, right? I mean, generative assessment is also from the literacy world, where you actually can measure things. So we really want to have those champions, politicians, civil servants who are reluctant. Those are the ones we want to win, because we would get them on board and showing them that here's the data that proves that involving citizens in this or that, design processes, participant making or whatnot, actually is going to make a difference. It's going to lead to better policies. These policies lead to, I mean, any which kind of metrics they want to sort of add on them, right? And here's where, I mean, I'm going to just kind of a very quick design synthesis, and this is very rough on the edges, and sorry for that. So open data is kind of the floor, but without data we have got nothing. And then on top of that is cultural code. Now, if there's too strong and strict and unbending, unyielding, unflexible connection between cultural code and open data, we basically have technocrats. And no one wants them at all, right? But we need them for a while until we've got something better. Because if there's no connectivity between cultural code and open data, we get populists. And if there's anything decidedly worse than technocrats, it's populists. I mean, this is just my opinion, right? Then from cultural code, we need to get to shared meaning. So, I mean, this is kind of what we're doing right here, right now. Even though we do need to sort of put our talking points in, right? Because we do have our day job. But there's possibly, if we sort of are really nice to Mick and helping after this hangout as well, there could be some shared meaning sort of annealed out of this.
Okay, John, I'm going to stop you there just because we still have a bit more time left, but I want to bring Davey in, and Matilda's got something to share with us before we get to kind of closing statements. Right, Davey, I think one of the most really interesting things that John's just said there is this idea of collaborative sense making, and you must, I presume, have seen this process of collaborative sense making, particularly with youngsters who are interfacing with the democratic institutions at Stormont for the first time. I mean, it has to be that that's what they're doing, making their own sense of who is who, what's making sense, what's not making sense, and how all this stuff goes together. Can you just give us a very quick kind of thumbnail on that?
I'll give you a very quick thumbnail, but I want to emphasize one phrase that you used there, maybe unconsciously, but it was perfect. How they make their own sense of. It's not a case of other people making sense for them. It's not a case of civic society organizations making sense for them. It's how they make sense for themselves, which I think is incredibly important. Let's say there was open government now. Let's say it just happens. Mick has waved a magic wand. It's there. Who's going to participate? You know, the activists are going to participate. The organizations with an agenda are going to participate. But you know, 3 or 4 kids who live in East Belfast who want to see change but don't know how to go about making change in their lives. And I'm thinking of actually 3 or 4 particular people. I'm not just plucking East Belfast and that number. How do they make sense of what's going on, and how do they participate? And I think it is the role of the active organizations to spend time with older people, younger people, and people who aren't necessarily articulate, aren't necessarily educated in this area, but have ideas, have a vision for themselves, and to work with them for them to make sense. And that's what we were trying to do, and Public Achievement still tries to do. And again, I don't want to steal anything from Paul because he's taking part in the event following this. But part of that sense making is not for me as a person working with young people to tell them how it is, but to work with them for them to work out what it is that they want. I'll give you a really simple example just to get. There was a group, a WIMPS crew. You know, public Achievement and WIMPS is all about politics. But there was one crew, which is a group of young people, who didn't want to have anything to do with politics. Zero, nothing. Okay, that's fine. So we sat down and we spent a long time talking to them about what it is that they wanted to do, and they wanted to have more underage gigs with underage musicians playing to an underage audience. How are they going to achieve that? And spent some other time working through how they're going to achieve it. And then the penny dropped very, very slowly, but it dropped. They had to talk to politicians to get this change made. They had to talk to their local council to get funding. They had to talk to people who make decisions in councils to help them achieve their objective. So that sense making is sometimes long. It's sometimes a process that can be a bit frustrating, but it's incredibly important, going back to the words that you used, that they make sense themselves, and it's our job to help them make sense.
Okay, I think there's a number of really... there's a point there that you made that I'm going to throw at Paul before he makes his concluding statement, and it really relates to this idea of what the role for activists might be, and perhaps that is to create a bridge between the politicians, rather than belabor politicians, that they must be the saintly exemplars of openness in government, without actually having something to put on the table. I think, to be realistic, on Friday when the Building Change Trust real-time event takes place, that's really going to be about what is civil society going to bring to this party, not just which government department's paying for it, so to speak, which is so often, I think, been the case. But Matilda, very briefly, you said that there's been a lot of support from learning difficulty organisations. Could you just very briefly give us an outline of that, and then perhaps segue into your own final thoughts before we close?
Brilliant, thank you very much. Yes, so the reason why I bring that up is because accessibility comes up a lot with terms like PDFs, and Davey sent across the list of things you can do, the 5-star list of things you can do, open data to increase accessibility. But we've actually, I personally found we had an NHS expo that we went to present what we were doing, and it became very clear, despite the fact that obviously we know all this stuff and we're trying to do it, that actually the site that we were using was not very easy for people with severe learning difficulties. That fed back into what was happening with the NHS. People weren't getting enough time, so people with learning difficulties were expected to understand something in the same amount of time as all other citizens, and so on and so forth. And the conclusion that we came to in the end was actually that if you design for the person who will find it the most difficult to understand, it is better for everyone. Everyone across the board has a better understanding of it. So we've just produced our easy read document with the help of an organisation called Change People. We have people with learning difficulties coming into the meetings that we have to do jargon busting, to make sure that we're communicating with everyone with equality. So, but it's hard, and I find myself doing all the time words that I would never have considered jargon before. I'm being pulled up on it, which is a little bit embarrassing, but it's fine. But I think it's the involvement of those organisations, and this is going to feed into one of my closing statements, which has just come from somebody else, that these usual suspects, the people who stand in for other groups. Now, there is a problem here that many of these organisations believe they do stand up and speak for everyone within that bracket, but of course most of those people will have never heard of them before. So actually, although yes, you want to engage them, you want to make sure that you don't step on any toes, that they're being heard and they're being linked together as part of a network, you've got to get 100% behind them to find the people that they don't engage with. And actually, often the people who are representing patient reps or locally, residential associations are people who always speak the loudest, always have their voice heard. So actually, how much do they need to be supported to have their voice heard? A bit, but probably not as much as your 4 young men in East Belfast. So,
Matilda, just quickly, because I've suddenly worked out how to read the Q&A app. So Will Perrin, I don't know if you know Will, but Will's based in London, and he's got an interesting question where he says, the generic sense-making stuff is surely a pipe dream. Open government, open data, open, closed, etc. will only serve a purpose if it serves a specific purpose, satisfying a burning need to get something done. So are we being too abstract in this conversation? Are we not being practical enough?
Well, I think I think that there are specific issues which push it forward, which act as catalysts, but the thing that you want to get done eventually is, and to change the face of democracy. So I would say that's maybe not a burning issue to many people. I think it is one of the issues. We need to have more we have the opportunity now with technology to become more democratic. And it's more getting that opportunity than a sudden culture change, I'd say. But there are specific instances where that makes it very obvious that that's what we should do. So they're catalysts rather than specific burning issues that it's important for. Yes, absolutely important for those, absolutely important across the board. So.
Okay, great. And just think about your final statements here. I'm going to kind of read this into the record, so to speak. This is from Nick Booth, who runs a fascinating participatory project, or at least he did, Nick, a few years ago, if you're not still. A community-based project in Birmingham. So not so much a question, more a thought. The data, as we were talking earlier on about, is only dry out of context. It's when you put it into context that it can be both powerful and fun. One driver for data needs to be community groups and active citizens. There, the understanding of how data can help their own ambitions will provide the context and the fun, the crack, the sense that, will sense that something actually important is happening here. So, and I think that's an important point. One of the things that Will responded to late last week in the run-up to this digital lunch was data sets that related to the giving of grants through Sport Northern Ireland. So that's maybe something we'll try and follow up with in a more practical way after this session. Last one is from John Fitzpatrick, who I think is a taxi driver down in Cork, but takes a very, very robust view of government's engagement or lack of engagement with its citizens. As we sit here, there is an attempt to start a campaign to stop the privatisation of community development, which is an indictment of the government that does not like what community groups do or say. So I think that's a good point, well made there, John. So you can try and weave that in, but we really, if we're going to pick our kids up from school and do all the various things we've got to do this afternoon, we can't belabor it too long. I'm going to go to Fred first of all, and then work through Davey and then backwards through the panel. Final thoughts, Fred?
Well, I think I think it's a question of values. That kind of openness and transparency is a kind of progressive value set, and secrecy and surveillance is part of a conservative value set. So a lot of the rest kind of follows from that. How do you do it, or what do you do, or how do you explain it to people, or how can people understand? That all kind of follows along. And but I think we've seen in the last 10 or 20 years, particularly with the internet, that that networks are replacing kind of horizontal or peer-to-peer networks are replacing kind of vertical, top-down authoritarian structures, and that access to information and flows of information and those kind of things are the oil that kind of greases those, or that facilitates that type of structure. But it's a clash of views or worldviews, really, and it's up to kind of more progressive people, or people who are advocating participation, transparency, and accountability to say what they believe in, I suppose, and to see if other people agree with that. And then once it's only through public opinion can things ultimately change in a democracy, and I think that's the way it'll go.
So you suspect we may have to grind through another 2 or 3 governments before we actually get the culture change you're talking about?
I think we'll be grinding through them anyway, so it's not added to the list of things we'll grind them down over.
For good or ill, that's not a mechanism we have available to us in Northern Ireland. It's incremental, or it's nothing at all.
Yeah.
So, Davey,
my final thoughts is I wish I'd said what Nick Booth said. And I'm going to start saying it and maybe occasionally credit him. It was extremely good. What I will do is leave something for people to Google, and that's something I put in the chat window that we have to us, but can't be seen by anybody watching. Look at the 5-star open data model. Do a search for that and think about, can the 5-star open data model be applied to a 5-star open government model.
Great. Okay, nice and brief, succinct, and to the point. So 5-star data model. Also, I'm going to kick in Will Perrin's own site, 360 Giving. That's all written in words.com, grant data, and that's where you'll find the Sport Northern Ireland data. John?
Yeah, let's see if we can be really succinct. Mistrust. I mean, what are the roots of mistrust in our very use of language, our very use of structures, processes, design, kind of. So let's not sort of pave our kind of path all the way to the wrong place with the good intentions, right? So rather, but I mean, this is difficult, right? I mean, people sort of, civil servants have sort of earned their mistrust, and this works both ways, right? Civil servants rightfully mistrust the unwashed horde, and the unwashed horde obviously mistrust civil servants. Right? So there's a divide here. I mean, so this is kind of, if I would just have to sum it down into just one word, and it's sort of bridge, and as a verb, as a proactive verb, bridge.
Great, bridge. Okay, John, I love that. I love that idea of paving our way to the wrong destination with mistrust. It reminds me of a thing that the social anthropologist, the American social anthropologist, said, I think 25 years ago, that one of the most painful things in life is to climb to the very top of the ladder and discover that you put it up against the wrong wall. So, Matilda, final thoughts from you.
Okay, I've spoken quite a lot, so I probably won't speak very much, but I just wanted to say, you were talking about doublespeak and trust, whether or not we trust politicians that we're going to go into work with, or we trust the civil servants that we're trying to create more open processes with. And I just want to say that the less they think it's possible and the more opportunity they give us to try it out, we can make it work. So if they give us that tiny little crack and we can push our way into it and bust it open, I think we should go for it. So it doesn't matter about the doublespeak. If we can make it work and we can make the citizens engaged, then we're fine. Ooh.
Mick, you're on mute.
I can't hear you. Mute.
I'm a boy, I can't multitask. I always tell myself I can, but I was just saying that the message from you is keep it simple, look for the opportunity, make it work, drive on from there, and don't get too worried about the doublespeak or the culture war, even, for that matter. So Paul, finally, almost last word to you till I say goodbye on behalf of all of us. So in a couple of minutes, what are the sort of prime points that you've picked up from this conversation? What do you think is useful? What will you take with you to on to the event on Friday in Belfast? Paul, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry, I was just saying that you had done that a minute ago, so sorry about that. Yeah, no, lots of really useful points there, and added on to the OGP Dublin conference last week. I think there's lots, and as I said before, you know, I think there's huge value in this kind of international sort of exchange and learning. So we'll look to keep that going alongside whatever comes out of our seminar on Friday. I mean, I suppose, you know, bringing it back to Northern Ireland and what might happen here around open government as a concept, or even specifically the open government partnership, hearing from what people have said, and as well from my own experience, having worked in a number of overseas contexts on sort of democratic accountability and civic participation, open government won't happen by magic, and you wouldn't really be able to point to a country anywhere where serious progress has been made around making government more transparent and accountable without a mention of civil society and civil society pressure. So civil society is absolutely crucial, and I think one of the most alarming things that I found in moving back home from overseas was that the term civil society was virtually unused in Northern Ireland. Not that the practice of it is unused, and you know, terminology on its own doesn't necessarily mean a huge amount. But I think that concept of what the voluntary community and social enterprise sector is, in terms of it being an interlocutor between citizens and the state, is a conception that is held by a few leading lights in terms of Northern Irish civil society. And I think partly our task might be to broaden that out to a greater proportion of the organisations in the voluntary and community sector, so there's a bit more consensus around that aspect of the sector's work. And I think in doing so, we need to look as well at the the getting our own house in order aspect of things. So if we're talking about a partnership, and we're placing demands on government to be more accountable and to bring citizens into the policy making process, then the sector itself needs to be conscious of its own, what you might call downwards accountability. So I think going back to the roots and origins of what the voluntary sector and civil society is, which is essentially, to my mind, any grouping of more than one citizen is civil society. So going back to its roots in voluntary action, notwithstanding the necessary professionalisation and staff such as myself, but I think rediscovering that that ethos is really important, and perhaps to some extent that's been lost over the years and needs to be rediscovered. And I think also trying to find a great quote that I picked up last week at the OGP Dublin conference was around the idea that civil society has to be both supportive and annoying to government. And I think very often different organisations play one or other of those roles, and so maybe increasing the understanding that both are equally important. Not that every organisation has to do both, but and it's not just about organisations either. It's also about timing, knowing when is a good time to enter into a collaborative conversation with government, and when it's better to stand a bit more on the sidelines and critique. I think there's a real there's a lot of nuance in this, and it's a skill that is learned over time. So I suppose momentum will be the key deciding factor here. Whether they're, I suppose, again, whether we're talking specifically about the Open Government Partnership, which, is just a framework, it may or may not take off, but we hope that the concept of open government, nonetheless, regardless of the OGP, will take off. So whether we can, in our own modest way, generate interest in this and build awareness of the OGP, and then, we'll seek to take it from there in terms of convening some sort of working group, and hopefully, make use of these excellent linkages inside and outside of Northern Ireland that we've made today and last week, etc.
That's great, Paul. Thanks very much. I think there's lots of ideas been generated through all of that. I'd like to say thanks to our panel here inside the Google Plus Hangout. That's Davy Sims, Fred Logue, John Keldon, Matilda Munday, and Paul Braithwaite. What?
Murday.
Murday, okay. I just...
Supposed to be from Northern Ireland, so really you guys should know.
It's because we weren't properly introduced beforehand, that's why. So anyway, thanks everybody. Also thank you to our ex officio participants online. That's John Fitzpatrick. I keep saying you're in court, John, but I think it's actually Dublin. But Will Perrin and Nick Booth for some very, very good and important points. And just to finish with a point that John Fitzpatrick's made, and it melds a little bit with that last point that Paul finished his bit with, which is this: we are culturally predisposed to listening to people who agree with us, more pejoratively known as yes men. Sometimes we need to know when to say yes and when to say no, and not to be fearful of either answer. But thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. Well, I certainly have. I can't speak for the panel, but join us again at the next Digital Lunch. We'll let you know when that happens. But for today, thank you.